the commercial appeal, the little Memphis Daily, and this reporter sued the Department of Justice and won. It was a real Davy and Goliath story. And in doing that, got the government to admit that, yes, indeed, Ernest was an informant. And as a result of that, had to release some files associated with his informing. So all that happened before the film. And without it happening, I don't know that we would have had a film.
I think the story is important for the history, for the community that it profiles, and keeps us sharp about these issues of surveillance and government, how they label dissent. It's still a very relevant issue.
Welcome to this episode of the Woodstock Film Festival's Let's Talk Film podcast. I'm Katie Mejia. Today, I am joined by Emmy and Peabody Award-winning producer-director Phil Bertelsen and Lise Yasui, producer of The Picture Taker, I'm sure, and plenty of other films. But today, that's what we'll be talking about mostly. And congrats to you all, and thanks for joining me. You guys recently were nominated for a Peabody, so that's always a beautiful thing. And then you guys actually premiered your film, this film documentary that we'll be mostly talking about today, at the 2022 Woodstock Film Festival. So that's really cool. Let's get started and let's get right into it because I'm super excited to talk about this film. And so let's start with Phil. Who was Ernest Withers and why should we care?
Who was Ernest Withers? Well, he was a lot of things, somewhat of a chameleon, but primarily a family man and a photographer who took close to 2 million discrete images, not of all of which got printed, but many of which did. And his primary focus was Memphis life in the 40s, 50s, 60s, well into the 1980s. I guess the short description of him would be civil rights photographer, because he was a photojournalist for the Negro newspapers of that time. The Memphis, the Tri-State Defender?
Tri-State Defender.
Yeah, and then there's the Chicago Defender, there's Jet Magazine, a whole host of publications that, featured Black life and primarily the civil rights movement in those days. And shortly after his death, he died in 2007. He was shown to have been an FBI informant. So not only was he a civil rights photographer, but he was selling his photos to J. Edgar Hoover and Jet Magazine. And so that became something of a controversy, to say the least, in and around Memphis, where he was beloved and still is to this day. And why should we care? Because, it's not really a simple story of hero or villain. He chose what to tell the FBI and when to tell them. He chose what photos to share with them and why. So in some ways, he, carved out his own narrative for the FBI, and maybe may not have always been what they were looking for.
And that's a great intro, because what I love to do on this podcast is I like to show the trailer so that folks that aren't familiar, they get a real quick taste of it. So I'm going to go ahead and show the trailer for you guys. So enjoy.
If you could start out by introducing yourself by name.
Okay, I'm Ernest Withers.
What Ernest Withers did was unprecedented.
Photographers like Ernest Withers were telling the truth. And before Photoshop, cameras didn't lie.
People were murdered because they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that wrong place meant civil rights movement.
He was the chronicler of our community.
Ernest Withers represented a treasure in the Black community. We knew somebody was keeping a record.
Memphis loved my father, but that changed the day that it was announced that my father was an FBI alleged informant.
The famed civil rights photographer who appears to have also done double duty for the FBI.
There was kind of this feeding frenzy of intelligence. They wanted a picture they could put in a file.
You mean to tell me this is what he was doing?
It never dawned upon any of us. We just felt he was taking pictures.
This is so crazy.
Daddy said sometimes you find yourself in a position having to do things to take care of your family.
The volume of his work speaks louder than anything.
He shouldn't have sold his soul to a white man for $1.
So that gives you a little bit of a sense of what you were talking about. This is a very prolific photographer back when, that was absolutely unheard of. I mean, his photos are just tremendous. I mean, the documentary itself is just highlighting this unbelievable amount of work that how many photos did he shoot? I believe that might be in the trailer, but there was a lot of photography and a lot of documentation that, like you said, was absolutely 100% important to the history of the 60s. And then, why is it relevant today? Because we just didn't get that sense from his perspective, right? It would have been from mainstream media or whatever at the time. So maybe a question for you I'd like to ask, Lisa, is, how institutions and government labels react to the dissent of the times, and like how he was swept up along the way, right? How he, and he was a complex person, but was it easy for him to get swept up, or did he feel as if he had no choice to do what he did?
Well, unfortunately, Ernest died before we could get our cameras on him. We certainly called the archives for lots of interviews with him, but all of those interviews were done by filmmakers before the FBI revelation was made. So we'll never really know. And I think we consciously tried to avoid putting words in Ernest's mouth or trying to represent him one way or the other. He took that secret to his grave. So we won't really know what swept him up in involvement with the FBI. But if you look back at that period of time during the 60s, the FBI was everywhere. They were all over the country. They had some thousands and thousands of people who were talking to them on all kinds of levels, from just the neighborhood grocer who they would talk to and says, have you seen, stuff going on? What's going on with, protests? Are there any people to be worried about? To paid informants, which is what Ernest became. And it indicates a higher level of intelligence that he was giving them, and confidentiality in the kind of work he was doing. So, I think back, we now know a lot more about government interference and government surveillance because of the subsequent stories that came out about COINTELPRO and all those things. But that wasn't known when Ernest was approached.
Do you think he was a part of COINTELPRO? I mean, did you guys feel that might be a question more for you? But my feeling, and this was actually a comment that was on the trailer of your film, which I thought was really interesting. And they asked, if a Black person was approached by law enforcement during that time, the civil rights movement era, to be an informant, could they say no? I mean, could he have even said no, right? And then, did they compromise him, and all these kinds of things. A lot of people back then, maybe felt like they couldn't say no or yes or no. And are there examples? And because there has been other films documenting, for instance, the people that were involved in the assassination of the Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton.
I'll say this, Ernest's informant code was ME338R, which designated that he was from Memphis and that he was the 338th informant. So to give you some sense of how widespread it was, there were 337 informants before him, racial informants in particular. That's what the R is for. So, to suggest that, the FBI was approaching Black people with a kind of no way out proposition is likely true. It's very clear that they preyed upon the vulnerable. My series on Malcolm X, which dealt a lot in informants and information being provided to law enforcement, they were notoriously after ex-cons, for example. I mean, Ernest was not an ex-con by any stretch, but he was ex-military. He was also ex-law enforcement. He was one of the first Black police officers on the Memphis PD. So Ernest was a law and order man. Ernest was someone who believed in America, and this idea that there might be a communist infiltration among us and among his movement, which he really supported, contrary to what you might think because he informed on it, was something that I think appealed to him. But again, as Lisa said, only Ernest knows. Did they have the goods on him? I don't know. I don't know if Ernest was someone that needed to be persuaded to be what he thought was on the right side of justice.
And if I could interject, we searched his FBI files to the degree that they were released at all. And I didn't see a single indication that they were holding anything over Ernest in order to get him to cooperate. And I certainly think that would have been somewhere in those files. He never saw his own files, but if they had said, this is leverage to convince him to inform, I didn't see a trace of it. And I think we have to be careful not to take that agency away from him. I do think Phil brought up the point that he was a World War II vet. He had been a policeman. He came from another generation that preceded, the 60s radicals who actually took direct action as opposed to doing the old, NAACP legal route to challenge discrimination. So, if an authority like the FBI and the U.S. government, who had no reason to doubt them, would come to him and say, "Look, there are people trying to undermine the civil rights movement, and it's young communists, and they're up to no good." I question whether he would have any reason to doubt them. I don't think he trusted them hook, line, and sinker. I think he was very clever about, walking both sides of the fence. But I really, personally, just having read a lot of FBI files, I really doubt that they coerced him into it. I think he was a much stronger individual and very self-possessed that way.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story because, in most people's research into this, you'll see that, all of these organizations and still to this day are infiltrated. They've got the double agent thing happening and, people just don't know who to trust. Maybe he didn't, and so that leads me to the question of the nuance in the storytelling. And, the beauty of this documentary is that you've got these incredible photographs to just feast your eyes on, and you just get a total sense that you're there during that time. And he documented it so beautifully because it was from a Black person's perspective at that time and how powerful that is. So, my question to you is, with, working with him, because he passed, right? Working with his family, one of your questions, Phil, was, and talking points was how to build trust, right? Because this is a tricky kind of situation. How did you guys build trust with your subjects, which were mostly the family members and others?
I mean, Ernest was like family to everyone in Memphis. He was just that guy. So the film is populated largely by those who knew him personally and intimately, not just family members, but friends and colleagues. They're very, you could count on one hand the number of people we talked to who actually never met Ernest. And so to that extent, we were surprised to find how much love and support there was for him. I think we had anticipated there might be some bitterness and rancor for the fact that he had betrayed them, violated their trust. And when in fact that wasn't true. I mean, I think people understood that Ernest was doing the best he could with what he had at the time. Lisa was very instrumental too, though, and she's probably a better person to discuss what went into the care and nurturing of these relationships, because this film took many, many years to make. So there were plenty of opportunities for people to say no, back out, change their minds.
I think one of the Well,
Go
one
ahead.
of the rewards, and I think one of the validations that I hope, did the right thing in terms of how we build our relationships with the subjects, was that this is the first film that has been given complete access to the Withers archive. And I'm sorry, I have a lawnmower going outside, so I hope that's not interrupting too much. Yeah, we were the first film that has ever been given complete and unrestricted access to the Withers archive. And I think we're rewarded with that trust because we spent a lot of time with the Withers family in particular, discussing the film. We laid everything out on the table. We let them know from the get-go that we were going to deal with the FBI story because, frankly, it was dogging Ernest's reputation no matter whether a film was made or not. If you Google his name to this day, the FBI story comes up. So although that's a very painful part of the history that I'm sure that they would rather not have been part of his story, they were living with it daily. And so we talked it through and we let them know who we were talking to. And, they never asked for editorial control, which I thought was pretty brave of them. And they didn't see the film until it was done. We didn't show them cuts. So it took many years. Phil's been on this project. He can talk about that. But I came on it and thought it would be done in 2 years. When I came in and another 6 passed by. And I think it just speaks to the time it takes to kind of deal with this very complicated story about a very complex man.
That's incredible. And, we have a lot of filmmakers watching this, so people always want to know how things are made. So as a whole, how many years did it take to make this film? And then how, Phil, did you initially get involved in the making of the film?
Well, I guess if I'm being truthful, it probably took the better part of 15 years to make the film. And I say that because there was a period during the making of this film that neither Lisa or I was involved, that it predated both of us. And in fact, was started by a mentor of mine, a man by the name of St. Clair Bourne, who, for all documentarians out there listening or watching, Google his name and see his titles. He's a legend. But he and Ernest died within 2 months of each other. And they had barely gotten started. Is he the one that shot the initial footage that's in the film? He shot that last bit of interview that you see Ernest as an older man. I think it's the last known interview that Ernest did while living. And I think he shot that maybe, I want to say July, August 2007. Ernest died in October that year, and Saint died in December, 2 months to the day. So that film was left undone without, a director or a producing team for that matter, and ultimately landed with me by way of Sam Pollard and Saint's sister, Judith Bourne. But to make a long story short, it was years later that the revelations about his FBI informing came along, and that's when the film kind of got reignited and took a more popular interest. And I was working hard to raise the necessary money. It could only get so far until Lisa came along and really, unlocked the treasure chest, as it were. It's like buried
slowly.
Some abandoned ship at the bottom of the sea, and she swam down there and found the keys and made it work. So
yeah, superhero producer, swoops in and helps us tell stories, because I don't know how we would do it otherwise. So
that's exactly right.
So the main thing about him and his, and this is what I always like to ask people, what was the response, your just overall response to the film? And then just, you could talk about, I know it premiered in Woodstock in 2022 and it's, on PBS and whatnot, but what was the overall response to it? Because it's really an historical treasure. I mean, at this point, and he's so unknown, and it's just, it's so crucial. But what was your response? Anything that you guys feel, just because it makes it worthwhile. You worked on it for 15 years, you worked really hard. And did you guys feel a sense of accomplishment and the feelings that probably came from folks to see it, the family, and then everybody in Memphis and then around the world? Anybody can take that.
Well, we loved our premiere in Woodstock. It was really exciting. We got to show it in the Bearsville Theater, which was just, a landmark place to premiere it. But I have to say that I think our most fun and rewarding screening was in Memphis. We were the opening night film for the Memphis Film Festival, the indie film.
I love that film festival. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. And the whole town felt like they showed up. All the people who were in the film came. And, people who had been considered, the reporter who broke the story came. And so that was an interesting dynamic in the audience, because sometimes there's no love lost between the expose and the exposer. But it was a really great atmosphere, and people got to see each other who hadn't seen each other for a long time. And so we were nervous. I mean, no doubt about it. Phil, I was nervous, but it was very, very well received. And what was really rewarding is we did a private screening of the film with the family ahead of time, because we just did not want them to be out in public when we showed the film for the first time. And they were visibly moved by it. They told us they actually found out things about their father that they hadn't known. And, probably most rewardingly, they looked at us and said, "Thank you. You told the truth." So
sometimes the truth is just healing. It's the most healing thing at this point in our history. So that's beautiful.
And I think for them, the truth was that he was neither hero nor villain. I mean, primarily a hero as far as they were concerned, but they appreciated that we went to great lengths to demonstrate his real contribution to history. And so I think for that, they were really gratified.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a way to look at something like this and see if there was more positive than negative. And at the time, it was so complicated, and as we know now, J. Edgar Hoover, there's a lot that we know that we didn't know that they didn't know back then. I mean, you just can't possibly put yourself in the place where they were in the 60s at that time. So as people in 2024, we can look back and say, well, FBI was involved in almost every single, anybody that was anti-war, pro-peace, if you want to say, they were targeted. Like you said, they were on that list. John Lennon, from anybody who said anything about war is no good. And so it's interesting because that's where we are today. It's not that different. And so I was just curious if there was any, and always how that works when you do an expose of something government related.
We can go into the whole story of how the FBI files were even found, because Ernest, if you're an informant, government informant, that's supposed to stay secret, right? And so the reporter that you see in the film, Mark Paraschia, based on a tip and open, records in other cases, accidentally fell upon Ernest's informant number and went to extraordinary lengths to try to put these pieces together, and found out that he had been an informant, and at that point submitted, a Freedom of Information request to get those files. So, yes, the FBI did respond at that point, denying.
This was long before the film was even an idea. This was the book that came out after. I mean, not even the book. This was the actual, commercial appeal expose that broke the story. That journalist, Mark Paraschia, who's in the film, is quite right. They denied it, and he took them to court and won. So the commercial appeal, the little Memphis Daily, and this reporter sued the Department of Justice and won. It was a real Davy and Goliath story. And in doing that, got the government to admit that, yes, indeed, Ernest was an informant. And as a result of that, had to release some files associated with his informing. So all that happened before the film. And without it happening, I don't know that we would have had a film. Certainly not as quite an interesting one.
That's incredible how, and he could have just easily said, got denied and not taken him to court, so there's a hero right there, because it started with that in order for us to really get at the truth. So, we can't give up. Right. I think that's also a lesson. It's like, you can't give up. You really have to keep pushing, because a lot of journalists, they will get denied the Freedom of Information Act, request. And so you have to just like keep at it, because, you're going to hit roadblocks with all of these things trying to uncover the truth, and something of this magnitude. Just thankful that we have folks that are willing to do this, and thank you to you all for making such an incredibly powerful film, sticking with it. So I'll start with you, Phil, if you want to just give us a little bit about what else maybe you're working on, or where we can watch The Picture Taker, or any other information.
Well, The Picture Taker is available on PBS Passport.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was, and Lisa, God bless her, sat by while I finished 2 films simultaneously alongside The Picture Taker. So I released in 2023 a film called 761st Tank Battalion, which is about a Black World War II tank battalion. It features Morgan Freeman telling his story. That's streaming on Hulu, along with an episode of the 1619 Project that I directed.
Oh, with Roger Ross Williams.
Yes.
Yeah, he's here staying in the Woodstock Film Festival office.
Oh, is he?
I don't know if he's listening to this going, wait, what?
Oh, Roger, I said, what's up? It was a great experience.
That's fantastic. Yeah,
so
we'll put the links to all of these in the description too. So yeah.
Yeah, they're both on Hulu. So
perfect, Hulu. And Lisa, do you have any other plugs for you in your project?
No, none for me. I just have a plug for folks to look for The Picture Taker. If you go on the PBS website, unfortunately at this point you have to buy a membership, become a Passport member, and but it's under Independent Lens, which is the series who both helped fund this project and bring it over the finish line. They were absolutely tremendous partners, along with all of our other funders. Producer also has to send out those kudos. But please watch it. I think the story is important for the history, for the community that it profiles, and keeps us sharp about these issues of surveillance and government, how they label dissent. It's still a very relevant issue.
100%.
And if you're in the educational market, you can get it over at Good Docs.
Good Docs, yes. Love Good Docs.
For renting.
GoodDocs.com.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll put that in the description as well. Well, thanks again to Lisa and Phil, and all the best in your future endeavors. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.